This is the story of the inland waterways of the United States. It's not a dramatic story, like the westward movement of the early pioneers. The struggle to push the railroads across 3,000 miles of plains and mountains from coast to coast, or the roaring growth of mass production and distribution in our industries. Yet the story of the inland waterways is strongly interwoven with all these critical episodes in the history of this country. It's a story of alternate growth and failure. Rarely in the history of man's struggle for progress in transportation of the goods he makes and the raw materials he needs has a vital artery been abruptly swept aside by the rush of technological progress, only to rise again a half-century later to become an even greater link in the chain of transportation. The silent flowing waters and the things man has done to use them and control them, these are a vital part of the real story of how our nation grew and how it thrives today in a busy and crowded era of transportation and trade. At first, when early Americans turned longing eyes to the west, there was the barrier of the Allegheny Mountains, of poor roads and impassable forests. Only the rivers and lakes offered a passageway through the new continent. On the rivers, only sail and manpower was needed to guide flatboats of the early pioneers, which used the flow of the rivers themselves as the primary source of power. But natural barriers like Niagara Falls, plus stretches of rapids and impassable streams, kept the early travelers from using water transportation from the east. As men contemplated this problem, they could recall the advice given them many years earlier by a young surveyor and soldier, George Washington, who said,
"I could not help taking a more contemplative and extensive view of the vast inland navigation of these United States. Would to God we may have the wisdom to improve it."
They had the wisdom. In the 1820s, they broke ground for the Erie Canal along the low water level route of the Mohawk Valley, and the expansion of our rivers and lakes into a formal system of organized waterways began in earnest. The Erie Canal was an immediate success. Almost overnight, freight rates between Buffalo and New York City dropped from $100 to $8 per ton as canal boats drawn by mules replaced the freight wagons and pack horses. Often whole families lived on the canal boats to lower the labor cost of moving goods. Buffalo is nearly 600 feet higher than Albany, and the canal was built as a series of rising steps. Between each step was a lock. A lock is a portion of the canal closed at each end with a watertight gate. The water level in the lock can be raised or lowered to match the level of the water on either side of it. Thus, the boat is floated to the next water level. And then the gate is opened to permit the barge to continue its trip to the next lock. The Erie Canal, a man-made ditch 365 miles long, opened the agricultural West to the Atlantic seaboard and European markets, and marked the beginning of a prosperous era of westward growth. Spurred by its success, other canals were dug, a total of 4,500 miles of them, equaling a ditch longer than the span of the continent. Most of them were in the hilly and mountainous sections of New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, where the westward expansion began and the urge to pioneer was greatest. A great factor in making these canals economical was the simultaneous introduction of steam power for ships. The steamboat made the rivers two-way highways, overcoming the one-way limitations of the drifting flatboats. Now, in this first half of the 19th century, the inland waterways entered their greatest period of usefulness. Some 400 steamboats stopped every week in Cincinnati alone. They moved the great freight shipments of that day, not only to the cities touched by the canals of the East, but also along the great rivers of the nation, along the Mississippi and its tributaries. Then the very steam power that built the inland waterway system to its peak suddenly swept it into oblivion. The steam locomotive was here. You could lay rails and run trains almost any place, places where no rivers and no canals could go. You could build your cities where the resources were, where the timber was waiting to be cut and the ore lay in the ground, whether the rivers came to you or not. Rail freight was cheaper, faster, handier, and more dependable. By 1850, the sun had set on the great age of the inland waterways. Or so it seemed. Nobody realized how big the United States was really destined to become. The invention of the Bessemer Converter in the 1850s introduced the steel age, and an immense industrial boom followed. Steel mills need vast quantities of ore, coal, limestone, and scrap, and one ore barge can carry as much freight as 100 railroad cars. A new kind of inland waterway system has grown out of the remains of the old. No man who sailed on it in the heyday of the early canals would know it today. Inland water transport is being used by many mass production industries for long-distance bulk shipments, in which speed is not an important factor. Together with river improvements have come better terminal facilities to handle these large shipments economically, since taking off and putting on cargo is one of the chief costs in transportation. The coal industry is one of the major users of the inland waterways. There are about 3,000 tons of coal in each barge here, and there are 8 barges in this tow. The petroleum industry moves such items as crude petroleum, gasoline, and fuel oil, with up to 840,000 gallons in a single tank barge. Special barges move industrial chemicals like hydrochloric acid, sulfuric acid, and liquid chlorine. Some agricultural products which do not spoil and which can be handled in bulk, like corn, wheat, and other grains, are shipped in covered barges. Special loading facilities make it economical to ship some types of manufactured products in covered barges protected against the weather. Today, there are about 28,000 miles of inland water routes in the United States, more than enough to reach around the world, and more than in any other country. East of the Alleghenies are some 7,000 miles of waterways. The Atlantic Intracoastal Waterway extends from New England to Florida. The old Erie Canal, now the New York State Barge Canal, and the St. Lawrence Seaway connect the Atlantic Ocean with the Great Lakes. Thus, the eastern system is joined with the vast Mississippi River system. With its tributaries, the Mississippi River system exceeds 19,000 miles in length, including the Gulf Intracoastal Waterway from Florida to the Mexican border. West of the Rocky Mountains are a number of separate waterways, totaling an additional 2,000 miles. These include the mouths of the Columbia River, the Snake River, and the Sacramento River. These waterways move about 1/8 of the nation's freight, measured in ton miles, with about 3/4 of the total on the Great Lakes. Let's follow a typical towboat as it moves down the Ohio River from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, with a load of automobiles and steel equal to a 400-car freight train. Towboats push rather than pull for greater control and power. This towboat is powered with diesel engines. It carries a crew of only 12 men much fewer than would be needed to handle this much freight by any other means of transportation. The towboat itself will go all the way to Brownsville, Texas, a trip of some 2,600 miles, but barges will be dropped off and others picked up all along the way. The tow passes Cincinnati, a major inland terminal, without pausing. The signal is the customary greeting to a passing tow, this one loaded with cement from New Orleans, bound for northern cities. We find many new installations along the river's shore, brought there by the growing use of the waterways. The captain radios for permission to pass through a lock ahead of us. We enter the lock, one of more than 50 on the Ohio River, to be lowered 5 feet past a wicket dam, and again we're on our way. The waterways are maintained according to law by the United States Army Corps of Engineers. In Louisville, our tow takes on a load of new tractors for delivery farther south to Memphis. Only a few men are needed to add the new barge to the tow. In the old days, much of the river traffic stopped at night. Nowadays, night traffic on the inland waterways is about as heavy as daytime traffic. Arc lights and radar help prevent collisions. And the use of radar keeps the pilot informed of the shoreline obstructions and other boats. In fog, radar permits the tow to keep going. A radio telephone, which can call to shore or to other ships, increases the towboat's safety. Here we're passing a barge loaded with gravel, dredged from the river bottom. The production of sand and gravel is an important river industry. 1,200 miles from Louisville, we come to Baton Rouge, the capital of Louisiana, a river city that is also an ocean port for vessels that sail 230 miles up from the Gulf of Mexico. Shortly afterwards, we come to New Orleans, a major waterways terminal and one of the world's great seaports. This ship has brought a cargo of bananas from South America, up the Mississippi from the Gulf of Mexico. At New Orleans, our tow leaves the Mississippi and enters the Gulf Intracoastal Waterway for another 700 miles to Brownsville, Texas. From the air, we can see the channel dredged from open water, protected by a string of tiny atolls. The Gulf Intracoastal Waterway stretches from Florida to Mexico, a total of about 1,100 miles. The waterway serves Galveston, Texas, and connects with Houston, Texas, through a 52-mile ship canal. The Gulf Intracoastal Waterway ends at Brownsville, Texas, a major terminal for transshipment to and from Mexico, as well as for local delivery. This is the end of our trip. Here, the cargo of steel plate and pipe, which came all the way from Pittsburgh, is unloaded. It will be shipped by rail to Texas oil fields. After unloading, a cargo of Mexican fluorspar is taken on for the long return trip to Pittsburgh. No matter what the cargo or what the route, the story of a towboat trip is much the same. The slow but large-scale delivery of products and raw materials for today's heavy industry. On some waterways, such as the Tennessee River, automobiles are transported on new self-propelled barges, a fifth of a mile long. New dams and locks are being built for improved navigation, as well as for flood control. Often, rivers take on the appearance of gigantic lakes. This, then, is the story of our inland water transportation. Today, as in the early days of the nation, the wish of George Washington concerning the vast inland navigation of these United States still rings true when he said,
Would to God we may have the wisdom to improve it.